Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're joining us today. I'm Jim Barnhart, Assistant to the Administrator in USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, as well as the Deputy Coordinator for Development for Feed the Future. It's great to speak with you. I'm excited that Feed the Future is able to host this virtual conference today. There's a stellar lineup of speakers and activities, and I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion. The ICTforAg conference brings together two topics that are central to USAID's development activity: agriculture and digital technology. The hard work of farming is often overlooked in our modern age, and having the right resources and support makes all the difference when you're out in the field, particularly for smallholder farmers for whom digital tools can be a game changer. For example, digital communication simplifies transactions and provides a way to share information quickly and safely. Easy and accurate access to weather forecasting helps to inform appropriate times to plant or to harvest crops, and early warning and predictive analytics have been helpful in addressing some aspects of the locust infestation we're confronting now in East Africa. We know how important these features are in the middle of a global pandemic, and I can't overstate how much agriculture and food security have been hit by COVID-19. The second-order shocks to global food supply chains have been devastating. More than 100 million people are at risk of chronic hunger, and the pandemic has rolled back years of development progress. Women have been disproportionately impacted by these shocks. Prior to the pandemic, their potential to be powerful agents of change were already hampered by limited access to markets and information. This gender divide will widen if we don't take concerted efforts now to create more open, inclusive, and digital ecosystems. And that's why USAID is focusing on making it easier for smallholder farmers, many of whom are women, and accompanying private sector companies to do business, both during the pandemic and after. Digital technology is the key to achieving this vision. We're working towards this vision through our digital strategy, which the agency launched back in April, and it maps out how we are prioritizing digital in our humanitarian and development programs going forward. In short, the strategy is a testament to how much we believe in the potential of digital technologies. And for food security, this strategy has big implications. The people we serve aren't just seeing our assistance in the form of food and water donations or governance programs. They are seeing it on their mobile devices. I'm talking about apps and tools that reduce crop loss, decrease herd death, increase yields, share price and other information, prevent storage, and increase incomes. We have evidence from our impact assessments that linking smallholder farmers to digital technologies can increase household income by 20 to 40% due to larger yields and better access to markets. I'll repeat that. Bringing digital technology to smallholder farmers can increase household income by 20 to 40%. These are enormous wins that produce long-term benefits for smallholder farmers around the world. We've already seen the impact of digital in agriculture practice. One of USAID's programs in Honduras, called the Coffee Alliance, developed a virtual training program to assist 5,400 smallholder farmers who were facing mobility restrictions during the pandemic. The digital channels provided technical assistance to improve coffee production and business practices. And when we looked at the statistics afterwards, we found that digital tools doubled the number of women able to access services through the Coffee Alliance. This is the power of digital at work. Sustainable long-term impact in the form of digital technology is just one way we empower countries on their journeys to self-reliance. And these journeys cannot happen without strengthening digital ecosystems that are open, inclusive, and secure. And today we will have important discussions on how we can achieve these goals. I'm excited to see what we can accomplish together. Thank you.
So far in our ICTforAg global keynotes, we've covered two of the most major disruptions that we are facing today, COVID-19 and climate change. But we also know that crises and shocks never happen one at a time. Instead, they happen all at once and compound on one another. This next session, Digital Responses to Layered Disruptions, will look specifically at how we can use ICT and digital solutions to prepare us for when disruptions are happening all together or one on top of another. Stay tuned.
Hello and welcome everyone to our third keynote of the day, Digital Responses to Layered Disruptions. I am joined right now by our panelists, Brian King of the CGIAR Big Data Platform. I'm joined by Moshmi Khan of the Foundation for Charitable Activities in Bangladesh, and Eric Lovell of ESRI. We're going to start today with Brian King. So I'll hand it over to you, Brian.
Hello, everybody. My name is Brian King. I serve as the coordinator of the CGIAR platform for big data in agriculture, and I'm really happy to join you today to talk about data and managing layered disruptions. So about 20 years ago, there was this real upsurge in research and consulting effort, and I'm sure many millions of dollars that started to go into supply chain resilience. A shock would emerge, and and then the learning would sort of happen after the shock. So we're talking about things like economic disruptions, massive market disruptions, natural disasters, acts of war, and so forth. And so, we began to look into this literature during the COVID crisis. And as you get into it, it sort of starts to seem a little bit discouraging, because a shock emerges, there's a sort of post-mortem, and then we learn a little bit more about how do we manage that particular kind of shock. And then another shock comes, and another shock comes, and another shock comes. And so the more you get into it, though, there starts to be kind of a signal coming through. And that is about the special role of information sharing. One particular paper I came across calls it knowledge management. And I took the liberty of saying, sharing data, connecting with people, being able to build flexibility and visibility and velocity and collaboration were exactly how it was stated in one particular paper that kind of gelled this understanding from the literature. And so another thing about this is that they're describing multi-sided networks, of describing stakeholders that need to be collaborating quickly to be able to manage some particular type of disruption. And a particular paper, because it's supply chain, was looking at supply networks and distribution networks. And so before it was even sort of in vogue, they're talking about digital platforms. And so this is kind of in the DNA, I think, about how do we manage these combinatorial shocks, these layered disruptions. And we've learned a little bit about it through the big platform for big data and agriculture, through a digital innovation process we run called the Inspire Challenge, where we try to get some funding to proof of concept stage projects where they can kind of push the limits of the possible in digital agriculture. And so a couple of examples that kind of illustrate where I think we can be claiming this potential within digital platforms and for managing combinatorial or layered shocks. So the first of these that I'll mention briefly is a project called Seeing is Believing. And the basic idea of this project was that they worked with about 33,000 wheat farmers that were already customers of an existing insurance service or product. And they guided those wheat farmers to take a picture of their wheat field with very high frequency. I can't remember how many times a week, but a lot. And this really quickly became into a massive data stream of these crop images. And then the team was able to use some machine learning techniques on the back end to be able to recognize crop growth stage of those individual crop fields, and then be able to layer that with data to be able to then feed back out timely, very personalized and localized agricultural advisory content. So this, built some great momentum and was successful and contributed to the overall viability of the insurance product and so forth. And so the interesting thing about this is how it enabled a pivot when COVID came. So this existing infrastructure, these existing partners were there at the ready, and we were able to do a small grant to that same project to basically repurpose this whole infrastructure and partner networks around weathering the current economic shock. And so what they were able to do was use that infrastructure to predict crop outcomes, and then to basically do one more step and predict future cash flow of these small farming businesses. And so that then fed into a microcredit product that was able to be rolled out very quickly. And we'll know in the coming months, the impacts of being able to do that. And then another just very quick example is a group of, basically a Facebook group of farmers that are trading information with each other. The triumphs, the woes, everything, entirely horizontal, entirely, peer-to-peer, trading this information. And so what we were able to do under the Inspired Challenge was build a kind of window into that community specifically for livestock health researchers and experts, and to be able to engage with that wider community around just specific animal health challenges. And so when COVID happened, this existing platform and networks of partners was there to basically very quickly, through some additional support under this Inspired Challenge, enable some essentially kind of interactive training content about weathering specifically the COVID challenge. And so this ability to manage dynamically multi-stakeholder networks, the ability to rapidly and collaboratively respond to challenges is going to become this increasingly important capability as we face more and more combinatorial shocks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian. Next, we'll take it over to Moshmi Khan.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And thank you for the fellow panelists, because I think we really can develop how technology is working in theory and in many cases practically. And I'd like to keep my comments focused on FCAB, the Foundation for Charitable Activities in Bangladesh, which is a grassroots village-based NGO working in the north of Bangladesh. We're very much centered on one village, Bagdumor, but we also work in the surrounding 5 villages. So I think if I give an overview of how ICT and Ag is working in Bangladesh, and one of our partners, Bangladesh ICT for Development, what their initiatives are, but I really would like to focus on the current reality of technology and agriculture by talking about our experience. So with that, I'll start by sharing that in Bangladesh, the government has given a very good policy and regulatory environment for ICT and Ag. So the government has developed the eKrishi, eFarmer Vision 2025, and mandated that to integrate ICT-enabled services in agricultural sectors. There's an ICT policy in 2018, which categorically identified a set of activities from the Minister of Agriculture and other relevant ministries to pursue smart agriculture in Bangladesh. These initiatives include call center, weather forecasting, fertilizer recommendation, software developed by the Ministry of Agriculture, and that development agencies would actually introduce a lot of these e-services, e-extension, knowledge repository, etc., through different projects. As you just saw from Brian, these are different things that are being rolled out in other countries as well, and Bangladesh certainly, under Digital Bangladesh, has been eager to adapt many of those. There's also been a lot of support from the private sector on many of these platforms as well as the services. And one of our partners for FCAB, Bangladesh ICT for Development, actually provides a lot of support in agriculture extension, advisory services, mobile-based apps for business planning for farmers and small farms, and virtual business incubation facilities for rural businesses, as well as conducting research on ICT-based research in usage and research in farmers in different parts of Bangladesh. Given the context, now I'd like to really focus my remarks on what's happening on the ground reality. So for us, there's three main issues of ICT and ag in a context like rural Bangladesh. Number one is access. Number two is use and utility. And number three, sustainability. So first, in terms of access, I know we were kind of joking about this earlier, but really the main issue for access is connectivity. This morning, I called our program manager in the village, and I can't tell you how many calls it took me to finally say, hello, good morning, how are you? They're just, and I had been asking for the latest information so I could make sure to give you guys what's really going on right at the moment. And we found that, she said, oh, the internet has not been working for the whole day. So this is one major issue, is no matter how good these apps are, the reality is on the ground, there's not always that connectivity to kind of support all of these technological advances. Number two, device. Many farmers still cannot afford the smartphone or whatever device, a tab, etc., that actually is needed to actually use these kinds of platforms. And in fact, if they do have it, they aren't always able to maintain those devices, or they'll break down and there's not someone to repair it. So the actual having a practical device on which to use these apps is not always there. And third, power source. I know we were discussing this right before we started. I will tell you, when we had the U.S. Ambassador and USAID Director, Janina Jarlujowski, who visited our village a few years ago, that day, there was no power. Almost the entire day, there was no power in our village. On one hand, I was kind of embarrassed and felt, oh my gosh, they're not going to be able to see things, because we weren't able to actually let a lot of people know because of security concerns. But on the other hand, I was actually very happy, because this is the ground reality of many places like Bagdumor, though the government has actually done a very good job of trying to increase power, but it's not always consistent or certainly adequate. The second point is use, utility. What we found is many farmers actually are not using these because they have traditional farming methods, which they're not being able to kind of coordinate with the app. So maybe they're growing mung beans, but then the app is saying you should be growing red spinach or red lal shak is what we call it in that village. And there's not that kind of good coordination between the traditional knowledge the farmers actually have and what the apps are telling them. And so this kind of how useful is it for them, that's a major issue, as well as how much can they actually input into these apps and into these kind of technological support. The last point is in terms of sustainability. What we found, Bangladesh is a country of 1,000 apps. Again, last night, I actually had a good conversation with one of our senior advisors, and he was talking about how there is no question that marginal farmers in Bangladesh certainly need and certainly can benefit from ICT. It's low cost, high quality, reaches a volume, exactly what Bangladesh needs when there's such a large population and the country is still 80%, if not more, ag-based. But the fact is, because of issues of training, coordination, and really giving the knowledge base and to the farmers, and because of the issues of internet connectivity, not having the right device, and not actually having consistent and adequate power, all of these combine to, on the grassroots level, while certainly ICT in agriculture is a very important part of, it's a tool, as I would like to say, it is a tool, but it certainly cannot supplant the traditional methods that are happening, but should be used in a way that can improve farming in Bangladesh. And actually, certainly in a disruption like COVID, there is definitely a role to play. But right now, we're not there yet, and we need to kind of figure out the connectivity issues, the coordination issues, and training. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Moshmi. Really interesting. Looking forward to hearing you all discuss those important issues. Next, we'll take it over to Eric Lovell.
All right, well, thank you all. It is a privilege to be a part of this panel, and I am excited to continue the discussion into the next phase here. My name's Eric Lovell. I am on ESRI's nonprofit and global organizations team. And I'm excited to present here and be a part of this panel and really be somewhat of a different stakeholder in this whole discussion. Being kind of on the technology side of the house, I'm looking forward to being able to share my experiences and my team's experience with working with a vast amount of folks who are working in the humanitarian and disaster response community on issues around food security and agriculture, and then adding that layer of complexity of COVID-19. So just a real quick background for those of you who may be unfamiliar with ESRI. We are a technology company and provider with our bread and butter really being focused on geographic information systems and technology. But we like to think of ourselves as much more than that. We really do focus on understanding what is that role in how organizations can best leverage the notion of location as an analytic. So ultimately what we're interested in is promoting spatial literacy through things like mapping and data visualization, ultimately to support issues around humanitarian, international development, and conservation initiatives. And as part of my role on the nonprofit and global organization team is supporting humanitarian nonprofits that are responding to disasters globally. At ESRI, we have done this for the past 26 years through what we call our disaster response program. And the disaster response program has been stood up and implemented to provide data and technology basically for free to those who are responding to natural disaster, conflict, crises, and now the most recent global pandemic. And as a company and as a program, we also are dealing with this notion of layered disruptions in the sort of way in which that we conventionally support our user community that were at, prior to COVID-19 caring about their disaster response missions and initiatives globally. With COVID-19, we also had to make a quick pivot to understand what is that role of GIS, what is that role of location and spatial information and data in helping those responders monitor, track, and best provide services in the time of COVID-19. So we saw through this process of supporting organizations go from more traditional disaster response to COVID operations, we ourselves had to somewhat bifurcate and kind of continue supporting conventional disasters while also continuing to develop solutions and capabilities and technology and data around COVID. And I do have this privileged perspective of working across this wide spectrum of organizations that have stood up and supported efforts to help with the delivery of services around COVID-19. And in many ways, what our experience was early in the pandemic. We saw a lot of humanitarian organizations, research institutes, U.S. government agencies, and global organizations looking to understand their role and responsibility in supporting COVID response. Over time, however, that started to shift to where they were starting to see, okay, with this is the new normal, how do we start to look at that intersection between COVID and the wide variety of crises and humanitarian situations that we're traditionally responding to, or we were responding to prior to COVID-19. And so we see, from our perspective, we've seen this play out from both the technology and sort of data framework, but also working with implementing partners and community, implementing partners and organizations that are supporting users on the ground and communities. And just a couple key thoughts that I want to take into this discussion, and that what I've seen from my position and privileged position of supporting a wide variety of organizations is trying to unpack and understand a bit more of this notion of integration. and ultimately to really understand what is that role of science and technology in making sense out of this complexity. In many ways, and as already has been suggested, disasters are already layered. They're already complex. COVID adds a completely new challenge to that whenever we're providing services in a way that we actually have to think about sharing space with one another, our ability as responding organizations to actually travel. And so there's this, from our perspective, I think one of the things that we have really stepped back and understood, and I think we have to continue to look at when we think about disaster response and this notion of layered disruptions, is integration, but it goes well beyond just the integration of different kinds of data and of different kinds of technologies. And so I broke this down into somewhat 3 buckets. I'm sure it could be broken down even more, but I think we have to really start at looking and understanding the relationship between knowledge systems, knowledges, disciplines, disciplinary lenses, and expertise. How does this manifest and play out whenever we're starting to bring together epidemiologists and WASH experts, water and sanitation experts, or food security and agriculture experts? This is nothing new. However, I think we're at this very interesting intersection of looking at these knowledge systems collide. There also is this question that has to be constantly brought into consideration is, where is this knowledge located? And I mean that in both kind of a spatial terms, geographically located, but also going back to sort of that disciplinary or sort of lens of expertise. And what is that inherent bias there? Again, at ESRI, our focus has been a little bit more on this sort of data and technology side. Ultimately, however, that question of knowledge integration and expertise clearly has is highly influential in how you bring in meaningful and authoritative data. So we're talking about integration across a wide variety of what I have here is kind of complex landscape of data. This is quantitative data. This might be systems around IoT and real-time sensors to monitor and track developments in agriculture. But this is also qualitative data, as well as unstructured data. We live in a day and age where there's textual information and data is constantly being reported and brought in to help support and drive decisions. And what makes this an even more complex time and kind of adds another layer of this disruption is this notion of misinformation and the importance of a QA of a quality control as we continue to bring in this heavy amount of kind of large stacks of data. Lastly, we have technology. So thinking about integration and its role from a systems approach of thinking about the systems of record or our data management and how that integrates with our systems of analysis or insights, as well as our systems of engagement. What Brian had talked about, this larger system of collaboration, of data sharing. What does that integration look like, and how can we make meaningful decisions to help support responders, communities on the ground with connecting to ICT and other technologies? Before I wrap up, just as sort of a thinking about how we approach this integration, a couple key points that I just want to leave off on and hopefully talk about a bit more in the discussion is this notion of plurality of perspectives and tools that help facilitate a co-production of knowledge. And here it is, whenever we start to bring together complex knowledge systems, what types of patterns and processes play out when we start to bring this out? And how does that help us make meaningful decisions and drive a deeper and more complex relationship about phenomenon that were at one point thought of as in kind of siloed manner. On our end, it's constantly thinking about lowering that technological learning curves to help provide access to those who are not familiar with technologies, providing easy to use applications, mobile applications that are much more streamlined and efficient and have a very singular focus to help build out that the capabilities of keeping a meaningful tracking, reporting, and analysis system, particularly in times when folks are no longer traveling. And so this does fall back on this notion of enabling this some of the remote systems that are in place, maintaining that connection through our infrastructure that have been set up from other projects. Ultimately, and just a point I want to leave off on, it's building, supporting, and relying upon local capacities and situated forms of expertise. And I think you see here on the right of my screen, one of the most meaningful ways that I've seen this, and partners that we work with, is We Robotics and the Flying Labs, which is a network of flying labs around the world, is really this model of providing data services for experts, so that no longer is it a time when we need to be deploying teams from the field, or we have restrictions around deploying teams internationally. We can start to look at where are those local knowledge hubs or expertise, and how can we best leverage those to continue supporting and standing up and enabling those remote systems of data collection and analysis. So with that, I'll leave it. And again, appreciate being part of this panel. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Eric. We'll move into our discussion next. I'm really excited to hear what our panelists have to say about each other's work, and hear a little bit more about what they see coming down the pipeline in terms of responses to both the current crisis and all of the others that are concurrently happening. My first question is around the differences in the current crisis and the changes, the pivots in order to respond to the current COVID-19 crisis. All three of you represent organizations that have had a heavy focus on supporting, whether it be policy or different stakeholders or the community, in responding to all different kinds of crises. And so what is the same now in terms of responding to COVID-19, and what is different or has had to shift? Maybe Brian, do you want to lead us off?
I heard about half of what you said, sorry.
No worries. You want me to start from the beginning? Or
yeah, could you summarize briefly? Yes, sorry.
What's different in the so in responding to COVID-19 as compared to other crises, what has been able to carry over, and what is actually different and has had to shift?
I think that the theme going through the resilience studies, and certainly what we looked at regarding information sharing and supply chains, is that there's always going to be another novel crisis. And we can learn about the crises that have come before, and we can be ready for them, and we can kind of diagnose and characterize and envirotype and predict based on that body of knowledge. And there's always going to be something else. And so I think that what's different about the COVID crisis is that the world is more digital than it was 5 or 10 or whatever number of years ago. And so that the agility that we have today, we're kind of starting to see it in new and exciting ways, honestly. So I think that's probably what's unique about this novel crisis. And it's not so much that there is one, because we can continue to expect them.
Moshmi, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I would tend to agree. I would just add 2 points. One is, what I've learned in the last 5 or 6 years working in Bagdumar is that Bangladeshi people are extremely resilient. And so you mentioned 2 issues earlier about climate change and just, different disruptions. Shirazganj, the part of Bangladesh that we work in, is highly impacted by climate change. And yet people have just been chugging along. And I was just looking at my message after not getting to be able to speak to person at length, our program officer. she said, you know, farmers there have not really been impacted by COVID, other than it is a disruption just like any other. So for example, many of these farmers sell their produce in the village market, or the town is the one, we're next to a town. And when everything shut down, they shut down. And now that everything has been reopening in Bangladesh, certainly, I know I'm very familiar with the garments industry and other industries, for a very long time, just like global supply chains, as other panelists have mentioned, were really impacted by that. But as the economy started, you know, restarting, our farmers also are now almost back to normal, I would say. So the initial impact of COVID was almost a standstill to their income, and then not being able to sell you know, any kind of commerce that they were already doing. But I guess what I would just add to this is not just the point about resiliency, but the other point is that adapting. What I've also noticed is our community has been very good at adapting to whatever the issue is. And it really kind of builds on what Brian said, is that these things will happen. And what I find very inspiring is the fact that people are just kind of take it in stride. Whereas here in Michigan, if we have a snow day, the whole world falls apart, right? And they're used to the power of being out. You know, I gave that example because of when, you know, these, you know, important people came to our village. Fact is, every day people are dealing with these issues all the time. So resilience and adaptation are, for me, the key here.
Yeah, Eric?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think it's funny. I think, you know, coming into this session, I think this notion of layered disruption, I did have to question what is the difference between the state of affairs right now and a conventional disaster. As I mentioned, disasters are complex, crises are complex. They're never a singular type of event, right? Like, I mean, if we're dealing with food, oftentimes if we're dealing with a refugee issue in an IDP camp, we're also dealing with issues around infrastructure, wash, food security, and so forth. So initially, you know, I was thinking about this as you know, how do we, what is different? What is the significant difference with COVID? And the more I think about it, the more I realize that there's quite a bit different, both kind of in a negative way and a more positive or optimistic way. I think that one of the first and sort of the biggest things that I see in supporting organizations that are conventionally would be deploying teams or sending a research staff out, total transformation in the ability to actually do field work, to respond to a disaster or, you know, an ongoing crisis because of COVID. There's a lot more concern of being able to monitor and track the health and security and safety of team members, which, you know, was always an issue to begin with, but now that's just this added layer, because it's not only just about where they are and who they're interacting with, it's where they were before and who they were acting with before as well. So we see a major shift towards kind of that ability to maintain, to track and monitor sort of large volunteer bases or program staff. You know, a point that Brian made that I think is really important to think about, though, is we are in a digital age, and where we were compared to 10 years ago is that not only is the data landscape drastically different, but the infrastructure of projects and programs having those remote reporting mechanisms, data collection mechanisms is drastically different. And COVID adds this actually interesting opportunity to where, because it is a global pandemic, regardless of what that project was that was working on before, you can quickly find ways, or organizations are finding quick ways to quickly adapt that infrastructure to help support, you know, COVID monitoring and tracking. There's plenty more to unpack on the data side, but I'll leave it at that for now.
I would be remiss. It's right there in our name. I have to talk about the data. So we talk about all of these various data streams and data types, and you know, in the scientific, you know, kind of data realm, you know, the work is pretty advanced on being able to classify research domains and then data that sort of comes in under those different research domains, and describe it in such a way that you can increasingly make very complex queries about, soils data and nutrition data and health data, what have you. And so, I mean, that discipline is advancing from the research side. And so, and tools like data ontologies and increasingly knowledge graph, knowledge database technologies, graph database technologies. But, we need to keep pushing on that data interoperability question, and recognizing that there, the domains and the data streams and the volume of data is only going to get more there's going to be more of it, and it's going to become more complex over time. And so it's investing in and figuring out the tools for managing the complexity of things like, there's a ton of data coming in through these peer-to-peer exchanges of farmers, and they're doing it in English and Swahili in that Facebook group that I mentioned. If we can start to start to interact with and understand and sort of engage with that kind of exchange, which is very human driven, very context dependent, and these kind of more formal domains of knowledge of, okay, well, how do we describe the environment, or how do we describe health challenges? It's only going to increase our ability to manage complexity. And I think that's a big overriding theme of this session, is that we need new tools for managing complexity. So the data is fundamental to it. I just tend to not go full data nerd because you lose people sometimes, but it's absolutely fundamental to this adaptability question. Thanks.
Brian, I think you're here to be our resident data nerd, so fully okay with me. I actually want to go back to something that both Brian and Eric touched on, and hand it over to Moshmi on the question of, we are in a more digital age than ever before, but what have you seen on the ground and from the grassroots level in terms of like the actual ability to take advantage of that, and where has that worked in the work that you all are doing, and where has it maybe not worked? Well, in this response, and then in the other previous disruptions.
So if I can, thank you. It's a really important question. And I actually, I'm a big believer in data, because I think it really does help you to hone and really focus on what of the interventions that we're doing that make sense. What my learning has been is that sometimes we get lost in all of that data, and that has been something that I've had to take a pause. And because frankly, I kind of am back and forth between Michigan and Bangladesh, and that's an opportunity. And I really liked what Eric said, is that COVID has had an impact on whether we work very closely with the University of Michigan, and we're not always able to actually physically put interns in Bangladesh right now for COVID and all of those reasons and risks. Having said that, that's where data actually plays an even more important role on the ground, because we had a recent study of from the business school, students who were looking at some of our Jibika, our livelihood projects, and they wanted to really look at data to see what was the impact. And so I think if I take one step back to kind of ease into answering your question, our program, we have this whole smart village model, which means our programs are actually integrated with the underlying theme being access to clean and sustainable energy as driving all of those things. Because as I mentioned, if you don't have energy, you can't actually do a lot of these interventions, whether it's health, education, water, sanitation, as well as agro/livelihood. And so for us, what we found that data actually has been a very important tool to help us to say, hey, we've just finished this 5-year, this just happened in the last week, 5-year Jibika livelihood project. Now, how do we assess that impact? And then say from building on this kind of, support that we gave to these 94 women led households that needed this support, how do we now basically direct our next intervention? So I think data plays a very important role. Where I might have a different learning, or something that our grassroots perspective has shown, is that unfortunately, as wonderful as all these bells and whistles are, and they truly are quite quite interesting and quite useful if we can use them. The fact is, these other barriers, I have a lot of data. We did a baseline survey of 1,100 people, our entire village population, as well as our surrounding of about 7,500 people in our catchment area. And the fact is, we're sometimes sitting on that data because of other barriers. So I guess for me, the cautionary lesson rather is that data is necessary, but it's not sufficient, and it's got to be somehow married to the local reality, which is why I'm not always giving the quick and right answers that perhaps Brian and Eric are very nicely saying, because I'm stuck between the reality that we're running this on WhatsApp and talking, and we can't even always connect to our folks, and internet meetings are getting disconnected, and people don't have the right devices. So all those things are our reality, while saying data is very, very important.
Yeah, similarly, I found really compelling in your presentation when you were talking about the role of traditional knowledge and of respecting traditional knowledge and cultural norms and things like that. I'd be really interested to have Brian and Eric respond to that in terms of when you are thinking about how to pivot these massive global organizations and do this good work on the ground. How have you seen that local cultural traditional knowledge being taken advantage of? Brian, why don't you go first?
The first thing that comes to mind is a bit of work that this amazing gene bank coordinator that recently retired from who's sort of equipped to make observations about how beings and humans basically have co-evolved over the last several millennia, and something that he found purely from a scientific curiosity and working from a kind of genetic resources or genomics point of view, realizing that he needed to look back at the philological record of indigenous languages to be able to try to reconstruct the history of this relationship between these different living beings that have evolved over millennia. I think that's really fascinating and amazing, and it really highlights that agriculture itself is culture. Agriculture is part of what it means to be human. But let's maybe look for a more recent example as well. The ability to, Moshmi mentioned WhatsApp groups. Extremely rich human-to-human engagement around very context-specific challenges that may not even be here next year. And so there's a diversity of just human engagement that's starting to kind of get into the digital realm that we don't really yet know how to engage with effectively. And so I think we're agreeing there. And certainly the access and the kind of usability questions, the human computer interface, the power, all of this is a dimension of that. But there's also a kind of human to human sense making dimension that's not working as well as it needs to work. And I think just being able to engage with the richness of that digital exchange is the first step, and then being able to see how do we begin to kind of use that in new ways to characterize the world. And then we already have the kind of communications channels and new mechanisms for engagement to do something about it. So I think we're just at the beginning, but having that engagement already in digital, sort of digital data form, for lack of a better term, is the first step. And I think we're learning as we go about that.
Eric?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think that this is a fantastic topic and something that I think is really important and in the sense, in many ways, it's a bit of what I wanted to position, how I wanted to position some of this notion of questioning or understanding this sort of integrated of knowledges and knowledge systems. It's not just one type of Western form of expertise versus another type, or a discipline versus that. I think it's the ability to understand sort of the complex landscape of different types of understanding and being in the world, and how that does affect, how one might respond, or what may be required to respond to a situation like COVID or like food security. And I think one thing that I think there's a really strong connection here that Brian, you mentioned, and I actually had it in a slide and then I took it out with the fear that someone would ask a question about it, was the notion of the semantic web and some of the research that's gone on with really trying to understand what is that role of knowledge, of language, of in this sort of big pot of big data, and how do we actually start to bring that in? So I think that you mentioned this notion of graph databases and sort of unstructured information, textual information. Having, in many ways from the data perspective, I think we think about knowledge almost too closely related to language, and that it just needs to be translated, and that's not the case. But I do think that's an important component here. But I think, ultimately, I think that building that local capacity and that ability to bring that situated context to the picture by looking at, a situation as it's playing out in a local community is deeply important here. And I highlighted the work of the Nepal Flying Labs and We Robotics, but ultimately what I think we're going to see is more and more need for remote access, more remote work. And we see that in the sort of from a spatial perspective, we're going to see a lot more sort of satellite imagery uses and applications. But I think that also means sort of being able to rely on local capacity where the knowledge is situated, where folks know the relationships between community members. They understand how a disaster impacts a community in ways that those who are foreign or those who are external to that community are incapable, or not, I won't say incapable, but are not able to immediately hit the ground and be able to ask the right questions or know exactly how to kind of position themselves without having some time in that place and understanding those connections and relationships.
Well, we have to wrap up here, but can I ask each of you in 20 seconds to say, what is your kind of dream for farmers and for the future of food security in terms of being able to respond to all of these many types of crises? Brian, I'll put you on the spot first.
It's meeting multiple and evolving goals, bridging sustainability and human needs and the biosphere, and knowing that it could all change next year.
Moshmi?
I think for me, the issue is how interconnected we are. I think this crisis has really illustrated that no one has been spared. And in our village, our program is really an integrated model. And one point I wanted to make is all these issues we're talking about with ICT and ag actually apply to ICT and health, ICT and education, because we have a smart board in our village, in our madrasa in our village, and when the power is out, no one can use it. Our civil surgeon, has really great telemedicine, but his team doesn't know how to use it. That's the first thing he taught me or told me, and it's a device that needs maintenance and training that they don't have. So for me, the lesson here is that we're all in this together, and kind of the baseline of the issues that we've all been discussing for this last hour really apply across the board. And so I think if we started seeing them as integrated rather than in silos, for me, we would make great progress for ag, for health, for education together, rather than seeing them as separate and disparate issues.
Our next set of sessions, Breakout Block 5, will look at different ways in which we can increase digital inclusion and inform our agro-extension. So go ahead and head to the Whova agenda and take a look at our 2 sessions. You get to pick which one you're going to view into now, but don't worry, you'll still get to watch the others after the fact.